Hello and welcome. My name is Biagio Mazza, Pastoral Associate at St. Sabina Parish in Belton, Missouri, and I'm here to welcome you to another Do You Know series question. Today's Do You Know question is, do you know the challenges posed by Matthew's parables of the wheat and the weeds, the mustard seed, and the woman with the leaven? In order to understand this, it's important to remember that chapter 13 in Matthew's Gospel is the center of the Gospel, and it's focused on 7 parables that unpack what the kingdom of heaven is like. It gives us the parameters and qualifications, or qualities, if you want, of the kingdom of heaven that Jesus preached. During the 15th to the 17th Sunday of Ordinary Time in Lectionary Year A, we proclaimed the entire chapter 13 of Matthew's Gospel. And it's important to unpack these parables in light of Matthew's community and what Matthew was going through. It's important to remember that Matthew's community faced 2 major difficulties. One was the rejection by fellow Jews of their acceptance of Jesus as the long-awaited Jewish Messiah, and all the tension that surfaced from that kind of rejection. Secondly, they were struggling with the issue of inclusiveness of Gentiles who desired to be disciples of Jesus and be members of the community of Jews. The issue was that Gentiles were not Jewish, and they didn't have Jewish background, and they didn't follow Jewish ritual laws, and so on. And so these 2 issues became crucial as Matthew unpacked the gospel. In these parables, it's important, therefore, to look at the context out of which they surface. As we look at the parable of the wheat and the weeds, we focus on a key issue that existed for all, and still exists to this very day, is how do we deal with the coexistence of good and evil in our midst that lives side by side? As you remember, the parable is the planting of a garden with good seed, and somehow or other an evil one comes and plants weeds in there. And so you begin to notice that as the seeds sprout, you have both weeds and weeds. The slaves recommend to the master to get rid of the weeds as soon as possible, but the master says, no, let us stay, and at harvest time we will determine what is good and what is bad. The good we will keep, the weeds we will destroy or burn up. And so the messages that are given from this says God as the householder, who the owner of the field, is that God refuses to take any action against an enemy and encourages patience and active living out of life so that, ultimately the good and the bad will ultimately be judged at harvest time, which is always a biblical notion for the end times. And so as a result, the explanation that is given in the parable, with regards to this parable, is that it's a warning to all of us to continually actively seek to be children of the kingdom of heaven as opposed to be children of the evil one. But coexistence of good and evil is something that we have to face, and that God doesn't take that away, but operates in and through God's grace. God works in and through the existence of both the good and the evil in the world. And obviously our call is to be children of the kingdom of heaven, to work and cooperate with God, to produce good fruit. When it comes to the parable of the mustard seed, it's important to remember that the mustard seed is a wild seed planted in a cultivated garden. So what message is this communicating? Well, the message that seems to be communicated could be 2 main things. One is, first of all, a small seed that grows into a large bush or tree indicates the fact that God's word, even though starting small, will produce, it will be large and will become significant over time and history. The second message is that a wild seed cultivated into a garden means that God's kingdom includes Gentiles, those that would be defined as wild or unclean, as well as Jews, the cultivated garden. And so the inclusiveness part of it is God's kingdom of heaven is also inclusive and includes both Jews and Gentiles, so that the wild and the cultivated can mix in the same garden. And birds will come to house themselves in the trees would be a good. Birds was always in association with Gentiles, so Gentiles will find a welcome in the kingdom of heaven, pictured as the mustard seed tree. And finally, we had the parable of the woman hiding the yeast inside the flour to produce an enormous amount of produce. And so what we have is small amount will affect a large quantity of material and will produce and become effective. Leaven also in the biblical tradition is always associated with corruption and so on. And so one of the messages that's being given here is that God's word is like that leaven that is put into the yeast that will include both traditional notions of what was clean and unclean. So in other words, God's leaven includes what traditionally would be associated with unclean or unholy people, namely Gentiles. And now you have God's heaven as being inclusive and welcoming of all, even those that would be considered corrupt by other standards. And so parables pose us difficult challenges and invite us to conversion. Invite us to conversion, first of all, of inclusiveness towards others, that what others define as unclean, we are to see as God's work in our midst and accept as clean and as members of our community. And thirdly, the whole notion that God is the one who ultimately judges. We are to focus on our own path to God and allow God to determine at the end time, at the harvest time, who is to be saved, who isn't, and so on. It is God's judgment, not ours, and allow God to do God's work. So I hope this has helped just a bit to unpack some of these parables in Matthew's Gospel, and I hope you will return again to more of the series questions to unpack more of Matthew's Gospel. Thank you very much.